I am joined today by two great guests. Our featured author is Bill Delaney, a writer, editor, and higher education professional from Jacksonville, whose work focuses on the culture and history of the First Coast. He is co-owner and editor of the publications Modern Cities, The Jackson, and Edible Northeast Florida Magazine. Bill will be joined in conversation by Alan Bliss, who is the CEO of the Jacksonville Historical Society and teaches history as an adjunct professor at the University of North Florida. Alan, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Allison. Thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks to the audience at home for zooming in and joining us. And it's a real pleasure to join Bill Delaney, a great Jacksonville citizen and a history-minded Jackson. Those are two great virtues, and I celebrate those, and he really is a walking, talking example of some of those terrific virtues. So you can hardly go wrong in the company of somebody like that. I have been intrigued by his work already, and am familiar with his strong interest and engagement with Jacksonville history. He is the real thing. He is authentic and engaged. And in sampling some of the chapters from Jacksonville, A Guide to the Weird, Wonderful, and Obscure, I'm satisfied that he really has made it his business to drill down deeply into some of the topics of Jacksonville history that are often mythologized. And any of us who have a taste for history know that some of the more popular historical topics are easily sort of, let's say, distorted, bent, steered off track a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
And so I salute Bill for his work on that. And I'm going to ask him or prompt him to discuss a little bit about some of them. I will probably also ask him about some of the things that inevitably wound up on the cutting room floor with this project. Bill, welcome, and thank you for participating.
Well, thank you. Thanks to you, Alan, and also to everybody at the library. It's a great pleasure.
First thing that came to my mind was to ask you about the entry for the Treaty Oak. So I have a Treaty Oak story of my own. I visited Jacksonville a number of years ago. Before coming over to teach at UNF, I attended an academic conference here, and the conference organizers arranged for a local amateur historian whose name I will not mention, but who is widely noted as somebody who has a passion for Jacksonville history. He boarded a tour bus, and about 40 of us accompanied him on a tour of significant Jacksonville sites, and one of the stops was the Treaty Oak, where he proceeded to pour out the mythology that you talk about in your entry on the Treaty Oak. I told that story afterward to one of my UNF colleagues, whose name I will mention, Professor Dan Schaefer, who's probably known to some in the audience here. And Dan registered a mixture of dismay and outrage at that story. So tell me about your exploration of the Treaty Oak story.
So the Treaty Oak, if you don't know where it is, it's over on the south bank of downtown. It's this enormous live oak, huge Lovecraftian octopus-looking thing. It's thought to originate sometime in the 1770s, meaning it's incredibly old. One of the oldest living things probably in the city. But, all of that is impressive enough, but it's also kind of accrued these legends. First, back in the early 20th century, there was a theme park there called Dixieland Park, and they used the tree as kind of an attraction. They wrapped some lights around it and put up a plaque saying it was the giant oak and that the local Indians, used it for meetings and whatnot. But about 20, 30 years after that, in the 1930s, that park had long since closed down, and the Treaty Oak was being threatened by the development that was occurring in that part of town. And, essentially, a newspaper reporter, in order to save it, made up a story about how it was historically important and spread it. And incredibly, that's not the only time that's happened in Jacksonville history. There's a couple of other trees where people made up stories about their historical importance just so people wouldn't cut them down. But in that one, he said that Osceola himself and the early settlers of Jacksonville signed a treaty under the branches of this oak That's how it got the name Treaty Oak. Before that, it was just the giant oak. It was just really big oak. But he caught the attention of a wealthy philanthropist, Jesse Paul DuPont, who went ahead and bought the thing. And then later, when development was starting to, kind of fill in around the area and threaten the root system, she bought all of that land too and donated it to the city for a park. And so the story, it's, I think it's like a history buff. It like really grates me that people believe that, but also the story has become part of the history because it's the reason that the tree is still there. Sometimes it takes a myth, and I know that reporter knew exactly what he was doing. He was, doing what he had to do to save a tree with a lie.
Florida, I think most of us who have lived here for any length of time soon enough discover that Florida is, at its core, it has always been, I think, kind of a big, sophisticated real estate deal. And a lot of times, sites and locations like the Treaty Oak have been woven into a developer's tale, trying to historicize a place and make it seem more interesting. I mean, it's not like Florida isn't interesting enough in its own right, just on the face of it, right? But there is a place in downtown Tampa it was revealed in an article in the mid-1920s in the local daily newspaper, the Tampa Tribune, claiming that it was the site of the first landing of Spanish explorer Panfilio de Narvaez. There isn't a shred of evidence to substantiate that, but it made for good news at a time when Tampa was trying to promote itself, as many other cities were in Florida, in the great Florida real estate boom. So not to be outdone, their urban rivals across Tampa Bay and St. Petersburg said, no, we actually have a site in the Jungle Prada area just off of Boca Ciega Bay. That's where Panfilio Narvaez landed. No evidence to substantiate that either, but there are signs identifying both of those as landing spots. So we should have our own legend.
Yeah, we absolutely should. And that's it's funny you mentioned another thing in the book is up in Moncrief. There was springs up there that in the late 19th century also were made into a resort and theme park area. And so the legend of that was that some French jeweler had taken the French crown jewels from the Revolution and lost them out there in the springs, so that you should come and maybe you'll be the one that finds them.
Are you sure they're not there?
I'm not. Hey, I'm not saying they're not there.
Okay, yeah. Let's not rule anything out.
Yeah. This is Florida. You can't rule anything out.
You have uncovered and covered in your writing some of what I think are the most fascinating and intriguing stories of Jacksonville's past, and that really continue to have meaning. So several years ago, the City Council convened a task force on civil rights history in Jacksonville and the African American history of this city. And one of the stories that emerged from the research that task force conducted was the story of a remarkable African American woman, Princess Adorecore, Laura Adorecore Kofi. And Bill has covered that story, and I wonder if you would comment a bit about your research into that. I'm pretty sure you must have left something out of this story, but tell us what you found.
Yeah, I mean, there's only so much space. I have to fit 86 of these things in here. So there's only so much space to talk about Mother Kofi, but that is an incredible story. She's kind of a more forgotten early African-American rights advocate, but in her day she was hugely well known, especially in Florida. She started out, the story is that she came from Africa and came over here and was part of a Back to Africa movement, where movements at that time were trying to get African Americans and other people of African descent in the New World to go back to Africa, their ancestral lands, and help develop that. And so she was involved in that movement and ran afoul of Marcus Garvey, who was kind of the head of the biggest movement, UNIA. Well, she, not to be outdone, he, disparaged her, rejected her. She just kept doing what she was doing. Here in Jacksonville, she founded a new church, the African Universal Church, and essentially like a whole movement. And she would go around the state and other parts of the Southeast and talk to churches and other groups. She would draw thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of people to see her talk. And then in the late 20s, she was assassinated. Someone shot her while she was giving a speech. And it's, the theory is that it was Marcus Garvey associates that shot her, but nobody ever was, like the crowd caught and killed the actual shooter, but his associates were never charged or found with anything. So there's all kinds of shenanigans that could happen, in that kind of story. But after she died, she was down in Miami when she died. They brought her body up to inter her in Old City Cemetery here in Jacksonville, and they made stops along the way, and each time, thousands of mourners would come out, and they interred her in Old City Cemetery. She's the only one there that has a mausoleum, so she's easy to find. In the back of the cemetery, that's graves that go back to the 1850s are there, and she's probably the easiest one to find, because as soon as you walk through the gate, you can see it's a white mausoleum in the back. And by people who are affiliated with her movement in her church and descendant groups, it's considered a sacred site. And they, once in a while, I'm not sure they do it every year, but they do periodically, they meet up out there for a ceremony on the anniversary of her death. But it's one of those incredible stories just hidden in kind of the outskirts of downtown that is one of those things, like, I think a lot of people around here have no clue.
How many in this audience have visited the Old City Cemetery? Yeah, it is one of the most remarkable places in Jacksonville. And if you've ever had an appetite for visiting cemeteries, you know that they have the capacity to tell remarkable stories just from reading the tombstones, the headstones in Jacksonville City Cemetery. It takes that remarkable aspect and I think cranks it up to a whole new level. There is a section of the city cemetery reserved for Confederate veterans of the Civil War. These were veterans who survived the war and then became residents in the home for Confederate veterans that was built in Jacksonville. As they passed away in the 19-teens and the 1920s, a burial plot was set aside in the city cemetery for them, and that continues to be maintained to this day by the local chapter, the Kirby Smith chapter of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. It is right next to, immediately adjacent to, the headstone for the late Judge Joseph E. Lee, who perished in 1920. Anybody ever heard of Joseph E. Lee? He was Jacksonville's first African-American lawyer and first African-American judge. He was an elected official in the late 19th century. He was, hang on to your seats, the head of the Florida Republican Party at one point around the turn of the 20th century, and he had an extraordinary career. He became an ordained pastor as well. He and his family are interred, as I said, just a few feet from the Confederate veterans plot. So if you're a historian, you have to develop a taste for irony, and
yeah,
we have plenty of that going on. So Princess Adorecore, Mother Kofi, as she is sometimes known, as you called her, remarkable because she was charismatic, interesting because of the way she died. There was never a actual convicted murderer, which kind of leaves a annoying, frustrating loose end. It's a little bit like the Kennedy assassination. Nobody ever convicted Lee Harvey Oswald, right, which has allowed this perpetual conspiracy theory to just linger, as I think it always will and probably will continue to grow. And the same with Mother Kofi. That was one of the intriguing things about her story, is how she died. But think about this. She rose to the peak of her career in the 1920s during a decade when women had just gotten the right to vote in the United States. And she was an African-American woman. And she was competing for philosophical traction and ideological accomplishment in a field that was pretty exclusively men's. It was African-American men's, but the Marcus Garvey movement that she actually coexisted with was a very masculine setting for black males. And Marcus Garvey himself never showed much sensitivity to feminism, and no doubt, even if she hadn't died in the way that she did, her story, I think, would be interesting in its own right, and it's mostly invisible, I think, in contemporary Jacksonville. So thanks for doing some good work about bringing that into the light of day.
Well, thank you.
You mentioned a number of other sites, one that's close by, and I think close to the hearts of all of us who are engaged with Jacksonville's music history, is the Gray House, just up the street. Tell us what you found in your research about that, and did you get inside?
I did actually get inside. I met with the owner that's had it, but the Gray House's significance is it's the place where the Allman Brothers first came together. The Allman Brothers band back, in the late 60s, paved the way for Southern rock, and Jacksonville ultimately became the epicenter of Southern rock. But it all started, not even at the Gray House. It actually really started right out there in Willowbranch Park. Musicians, Riverside at that time had become a major haven for hippies, musicians, the LGBT community, other kind of pioneers, and musicians loved the place, and the city came to really appreciate the culture, but the musicians would just play out in the park, have free shows. And so a group of musicians, they had met each other. Dwayne Allman at that time was living in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. He originally was from Daytona, and when he had friends here in Jacksonville, and when he was in town, he would stay with his friends. And well, one night he was staying at this house, the Gray House, right up the street from here. A few of his other friends lived in the house as well. It's a huge house that at that time was divided into 4 or 5 apartments. And he and his friends, they met a couple of other musicians. It's Butch Trucks and
Barry Oakley.
Yeah.
And Dickie Betts.
Yeah, and JMO, he has a JMO is how he goes, what he goes by. But so they met up. Dwayne invited the group of them back to the house. He had a new concept for a band that would have 2 drummers and 2 guitarists, and supposedly they had a jam, and reportedly it was so incendiary that Dwayne Allman said that anybody that wanted to leave without agreeing to form a band had to fight him to get out. And so they still didn't have a singer at that time after the jam. But Dwayne's brother, Greg, was out in L.A., and so he called him, said, he's got a great voice, and he can play keyboards, Hammond organ. So they invited him out. 3 days later, he's in Jacksonville, and they have their first show as the original incarnation. And just a few days after that, they booked their first gig up at the Jacksonville Armory here in town. So really, it has a claim to being really the first Southern rock show. And they left town only a few weeks later. The Allman Brothers moved up to Macon, Georgia, but they inspired so many people locally that there's half a dozen, internationally successful bands that came from Jacksonville in their wake, and there still are.
So there is a Allman Brothers Museum in Macon, Georgia. It's called the Big House. How many have been there to the Big House Museum? Oh, it's a site of pilgrimage for Allman Brothers fans, is it not? A group of us carpooled up there a year ago in March, and to pay it a visit, because we have, as you may know, at the Historical Society is positioning to launch a music history project, Music History Museum here in Jacksonville, and the Allman Brothers are a keystone of that entire project. So we went up to have a look at the Big House Museum, and went in and met the curator, Richard Brent, and introduced ourselves as a group visiting from Jacksonville. And you could practically see him stiffen a little bit as he realized. I was tempted to say, we've come to reclaim the Allman Brothers and take them back to Jacksonville, take their legacy back to Jacksonville, where it belongs. Where it belongs, right. So he was graceful enough to concede that, yes, indeed, they did get their start in Jacksonville, and he agreed that that's a critical part of the story. They spent the formative 2.5 years of their recording career in Macon, because that's where Capricorn Studios was, and so they rented the big house, and a number of them lived there at the time. It really is a worthwhile place for a visit. It's steeped in authenticity. Greg Allman, before he died, talked about it in a recording that they have that you can view at the big house or order. So, a great music history story, and Jacksonville is full of them. And you've run across some other aspects of that, right, Bill?
Oh yeah. There's quite a number. Another one from the book. It's something that I don't think people pay a lot of attention to because it was considered kind of ephemeral. But in the early '90s, Jacksonville hip hop scene was like we had 3 groups. They're all affiliated with 2 guys that recorded national hits. They used the Miami bass sound. That's what it was called. It was a Florida-based, variant of hip-hop music from the 80s and early 90s that relied very heavily on drum machines and lyrics that are mostly about sex and partying. But it was Jacksonville. It was the 95 South, 69 Boys, and Quad City DJs who a lot of y'all here, I'm sure, have heard songs like Tootsie Roll and Come On Ride the Train. Yeah, that all came from right here too.
You talked about the Carpellis Museum, another little-known site. It's right across the street from the old Armory in downtown Jacksonville, pretty close to Hogan's Creek on the northeast side of the downtown core, and originally built as the First Church of Christ Zionist. And I'm pretty sure you've been inside the building.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's a gorgeous building. It's this huge white, classical-looking building. It was built, as a Christian Science church. And years later, when the church's membership had declined or moved to the suburbs, they were looking to sell it off. But the interesting thing about it now, the building itself is incredible, but it has quite an unusual museum in it. It's part of a group of museums that have the world's largest collection of historic documents. So I say, we kind of joke in the book that most museums rely on historic documents to build exhibits. Here they are the exhibits. And it all came, this one guy, David Carpelese, back in I think it was the 80s, got really big. He realized how much he had made a lot of money in real estate, and he realized how many historic documents were out there in the hands of private owners, and he went around collecting as many as he could. And eventually he owned so many, and he wanted to put them on display, and so he looked for places around the country, mostly in mid-sized cities, picked one in Jacksonville, and so now you can go see, documents related to the American Revolution, all sorts of things. Right up there, right kind of between downtown and Springfield.
The church itself, as Bill says, is an interesting structure, and apparently the Christian Science Church organization commissioned a fairly standard set of designs, and the building that you see that is now the museum here in Jacksonville is identical to the old First Church of Christ Zionist in downtown St. Petersburg, which has also been decommissioned as a church, desanctified, I guess is the right term, and it is now a performance venue called the Palladium. And they have stage plays, musical performances, and that sort of thing there. Good example of adaptive reuse of a church, which is a challenging thing for preservationists and a challenging thing for congregations that own buildings that, as in the case of the old Church of Christ Zionist, are now 100 years old, approaching a century of life or more. And man, oh man, as congregation attendance declines, as people move to the suburbs, ownership and preservation of these structures is a serious challenge. But they are filled with meaning for so many family members whose relatives, ancestors really have a history and a connection there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so
totally.
I'm intrigued by some of the things that wound up on the cutting room floor, Bill.
Yeah.
And I can mention a couple, but I wonder if there's anything that now that the book is in print and bound and for sale, and you're signing copies for your adoring audience, what is it that you regret leaving on the cutting room floor? Anything in particular?
Yeah, there's one thing in particular that really kind of killed me to leave. It was one I say that the hardest part of writing this book wasn't the writing or the research. It was having to decide what to leave out. I had dozens more things I would have liked to do, but there was one that I actually wrote the entry for. And then my publisher came back and said, no, actually, we can't go up to 90. We have to go only to 86. You have to cut a couple stories. And this one, it killed me. But it was the Sammis house in Clifton and the Sammis cemetery. The Sammis family were an interesting family. John Sammis was a white man from the north. His wife, however, was a part of the Kingsley family. She was mixed African American and white. Her parents were Anna Kingsley and Zephaniah Kingsley of the Kingsley plantation. And so they had a number of children that also lived in the area. There was another number of other black or mixed race slave plantation owners in that area. The Sammises kind of became, the central one. And after the war, after the Civil War ended and slavery is over, that part of Arlington, still remained for a long time a center of, African American, Gullah Geechee culture. Today, the house is still there. It was later converted into things like a hotel, a resort, and now it's just somebody's house right on the river. The graveyard nearby is the family cemetery. Even after the family left the area, they continued to use the cemetery and be buried there. So, there's over 150 years worth of family members who are interred there, right in the middle of this little Arlington neighborhood.
All right, I think we're going to have to demand a second edition of the book. That no doubt there are other things. Can I lay a couple of examples on you and see? So the old Ford Motor Company plant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was one that was on the long list. That was a former warehouse out on the Talleyrand area, kind of east of downtown, right on the river. But it's where Ford made a lot of cars back in the day. I'm not exactly sure how old the structure is.
1926.
Yeah, 1926. But it's really an imposing structure. It's very cool. It stretches out over the river, and it's got an incredible history. It was part of what helped build up the port and Jacksonville's position as a logistics center. But today it's highly endangered of falling apart and being demolished, which is a real tragedy. But it's definitely one that I wish, in addition to, it'll definitely be there.
I am glad to hear we're not going to have to arm wrestle over including that.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Ford Motor Company plant is on the list of the Jacksonville Historical Society's most endangered buildings. We publish that list every year. It comes out in May, which is National Historic Preservation Month. And that's one of the structures that I think really is iconic. It tells a lot of stories, and that's one of the markers of a building that really deserves to be preserved and adapted and put to use in our contemporary period. And Bill has touched on some of the reasons that it has value in interpreting Jacksonville's history in particular. It's a way to interpret, as he says, our role as a seaport, as a river port, as one of the places in Florida that started becoming an industrial center as far back as the 1920s. It speaks to the automobilization that characterized cities like Jacksonville that began to really boom in the 1920s. And somebody came up to me at an event just the other night, and somehow the Ford Motor Company plant came up in conversation. And this person said, "Did you know that the reason that Henry Ford chose to have a plant built in Jacksonville was because he had a mistress in Jacksonville, and he wanted it a good excuse to travel to Jacksonville?" I never heard that one before.
Yeah.
And based on I'm not a Henry Ford scholar, but based on what I know about him, it seems unlikely, but but I'm going to leave that one to Bill Delaney to drill down into when it's time to come out with the next edition. So another example of a maybe a Volume 2 candidate might be Riverside Baptist Church.
Mm-hmm.
You know the story, I guess, about Addison Meisner's role in designing it.
Yeah, it was another one that was on the long list. I do know a little bit about it. I had gotten into some preliminary research, but the most interesting thing to me, like, it has a very unusual design for a Baptist church. And in fact, when the architect designed it, some members of the congregation were unhappy. They said it looked more like something aesthetically that Catholics would want than Baptists. But it survived. It's definitely one of those things that people came around to, because now it's considered just a prime piece of Riverside architecture now. Now I think, like, anybody would see it and say, like, yeah, that's a great building. But at the time, people just didn't see it.
I think it's the northernmost of the portfolio of Meisner's creations. Addison Meisner was a noted architect in boomtime Florida in the 1920s, and most noted for his work in southeast Florida. But he is given credit, some would call it blame, for inspiring the tidal wave tsunami of Mediterranean revival architecture that swept through Florida in the 1920s and has persisted down to the present day. And it's not just Florida anymore, but Mediterranean revival really closely associated with the Florida real estate boom. And you can see that theme emerging in Riverside.
Riverside, San Marco, like a bunch of neighborhoods have
San
buildings
Jose.
like that, yeah.
On both sides of the river. Yeah. So what about the Old National Guard Armory downtown?
Yes, when I just mentioned, it was a place that it was the Allman Brothers' first show was held there, but the Armory was built as a National Guard armory, but it had a big open hall in the center that they would use, for like every day. I think they would use it for mess, but they also would use it for events. Like, they'd open it up for dances and concerts. Yeah, and years later, it was built in the teens or 20s, and years later, in the 1960s, it became a popular place for concerts. It was something that was kind of few and far between. Back then, your choices were playing in a bar or in a park or something, or some groups that were getting big enough were playing in stadiums and arenas, but especially in Jacksonville, there wasn't a lot of other options, and it served as a place where a lot of famous touring acts played. A lot of locals got their start there or went to go hear music and be inspired. That one does have kind of a happy progression. Unlike the Ford plant, there's a plan to restore the building and put it to a new use. So it doesn't seem likely to be demolished, but it's definitely one that needs to be saved. It needs to be, we got to get that one moving.
So those are some examples. I wonder if there's anything. That's a great story about the Stamis house. How is that name spelled, by the way?
Stamis, S-A-M-M-I-S.
Stamis, yeah. That's a new one on me, so thanks a lot for sharing that.
Yeah.
Are there others that have kind of lodged themselves in your memory?
Yeah, there was a few that I kind of combined. I found a way to at least mention them or include the pictures I took. That was, part of the hard part of this was having to go around during COVID to all these places and get my own pictures. But in Mayport, I ended up doing just one entry on Mayport. But there's several things in Mayport that could have their own story. The lighthouse, both houses, the one that currently works and the historic one from the 1850s. There's the King House out there, which is this big former mansion of the King family, but they gained renown for ghost stories. They claimed it was the most haunted place in Duval County, and people still say that. Those people interested in ghost stories still say that, but it's got a lot of that kind of rich local lore attached to it. Yeah, so those are, some. Like, I was happy to be able to include some parts of Mayport, but it's one of those places that it's really hard to tell the whole story. I mean, I could almost do, this book covers a lot of different parts of town and some of the wider region, like St. Augustine and Fernandina, and that's, part of when I was winnowing things down. I just said, like, I don't want any one part to dominate the book. You could write one of these books on St. Augustine alone. You could probably do one on Riverside alone. But I want to, make sure that we cover a broad spectrum.
You covered a broad geography. Jacksonville is in the title, but I think that you were pretty intentional about making a selection of places that are relevant to those of us who are Jacksons, right? Mm-hmm. And so the northernmost, I think, in your reach is in Fernandina Beach, the shrimp industry article, I would say.
Yeah.
Right? And the southernmost, Marineland?
Yeah. Southernmost is Marineland. The westernmost is Barden, a little logging town that claims to have its own Sasquatch. It's a real fun one, the Barden Booger. There's not really anything that's easternmost because, it's ocean, but there's a number of eastern things. Yeah, the shrimp. The shrimp is the easternmost.
And what other remote sites? You said Barden, that's outside of Duval County.
Yeah, that's
right?
out in Putnam County, not far from Palatka.
Okay. Any other non-Duval County sites that cropped up in this project?
Yeah, I got a couple in St. John's and St. Augustine. I did Green Cove Springs. I did the story of the pool, the spring-fed pool in the middle of the town called Spring Park. It's one of the many springs in Florida that was claimed to be the fountain of youth and that it had healing waters. And the reason that there's a town there and it's not just still woods and a couple of residences because they turned it into a resort. And you can still swim in the pool. In the 1930s, it was a Works Progress Administration project where they used the spring to feed, a modern swimming pool for people to swim in. It's a public pool, anybody can go. Costs like $5. It's really cool. It's one of those things that's right outside of Jacksonville that, I'd never been there. But it had an interesting story, and it's pretty cool looking.
It is cool. Well, literally, the water that comes out of the spring is chilly, but it is a beautiful sight. How many have been there to the Green Cove Springs pool? Yeah, and it's magnificently restored by the city of Green Cove Springs now. It's well worth a visit, even if you're too warm-blooded to go swimming in the spring waters, as I tend to be. As Allison mentioned, I think at the beginning, we're inviting all of you to make some notes about questions that occur to you. I've been monopolizing the question asking here, but we're open to others, and there are notepads, clipboards, and pens underneath each of your seats. If something has occurred to you that you'd like to hear Bill talk about, please make a note of that, and Allison will collect those and bring them up as they occur to you. Is it about time to invite people for questions now, Allison?
Yes, it is exactly that time. So I have a couple questions for you from our Zoom audience, but under your seats are those clipboards. Feel free to write your questions down, and I'll come around and collect them.
So from the Zoom audience, Amanda wants to know, what about Leonard Skinner? What about him?
So Leonard Skinner is another one that I could have picked a number of sites connected with them, and you could do a book like this on just Jacksonville music history, and it would it could probably be even longer than this one, but Skinner came here. We talked about the Allman Brothers earlier. They were one of the bands. They were in high school at the time the Allman Brothers were playing. They're from the West Side. The original members were, and they were one of the groups of local musicians that was inspired by the Allman Brothers and some of the other very early musicians. The family home is still out there, but I do have in the book the grave. Ronnie Van Zandt actually has two grave sites. He was originally buried in Orange Park in Jacksonville Memory Gardens. after he died in a plane crash in 1977, along with several other members of the band. He was buried there until 2000 when the grave was vandalized, and after that point, the family moved his remains up to Riverside Memorial Park, which is not to be confused with the Memorial Park that's on the river, as a cemetery. But now a number of members of Leonard Skinner and some other bands are buried in that cemetery, and they're relatively easy to find. Somebody else who is not a musician, but Leonard Skinner is the source of the band name. He's called the most famous gym coach in American pop culture. But he was the gym coach of Ronnie Van Zant and a couple of the other early members who they remembered giving them a hard time for their long hair. And he always said he wasn't picking on them. It was not his rule. It was the school's policy on long hair. And after they went on to success, after they had graduated, they came back and they actually made friends with the guy. And he made bank on his name being Leonard Skinner after that. There's a picture in one of their albums of his real estate business. He owned a bar called Leonard Skinner's. It's now a strip club on the west side, but a very historic strip club. But yeah, there's so much Leonard Skinner. There's so many Leonard Skinner stories in this town. I mean, you honestly could almost write a book just on Leonard Skinner sites.
Well, we had a conversation a few months back, Allison will recall, and some of you may have been here for that night when we talked about a book on the history of Southern rock, and Jacksonville's connection with that is kind of a root site, and Leonard Skinner is certainly a part of that story. I hope the grave sites that you're referring to are less easy to vandalize in their new location. I haven't seen them.
They're at least they're more visible from the front. It would be tough to get in there at night and get past the cameras and whatnot. And also supposedly his actual grave is not where his marker is. They have a headstone up for him that's kind of become a shrine for fans. People go out there and they'll leave guitar picks and beer cans and all sorts of things, in tribute to him.
Same in Macon at Rose Hill Cemetery, which is the grave site of Greg and Dwayne Allman and Barry Oakley and a few others. And those grave sites were pilgrimage sites and badly vandalized in the first several years that they were buried there. Now they've been, the headstones had to be reconditioned because people would go and try to chip pieces of granite off of them. And so the headstones and the grave sites themselves are surrounded by an iron fence, and you can't actually approach the headstones. But people still go there. I made the pilgrimage when I was there, and people still leave love offerings at the grave sites for the Allman brothers in Macon. So another question is, what was the hardest secret to research, and which one was the most fun?
That's a good question. Probably the one that took the most work was possibly the shrimp history. Included in there the Jacksonville area, Fernandina, Mayport, and to an extent St. Augustine, were the birthplace of the modern shrimping industry. In Fernandina Beach, local shrimpers up there made innovations that are still used now. They pioneered using a motorboat to get shrimp so you can go farther out. You don't have to stay on shore and cast nets from rowboats. They also pioneered the currently used trawl net. The otter trawl is what it's called, and it's essentially a net that has a big open mouth that shrimp and other things that pass through it get pushed back into the net, and that's still what's used today. Like all those shrimp boats you see heading out on the river out to sea from Mayport, that's still what they use today. Anywhere else in the world you go, that's how they're catching shrimp, and that all started here. So that took a lot of research and a lot of kind of winnowing down to make it be able to fit. The most fun story, I think the most fun story to me was the story of the Orange Park Humanzee, which, I see a couple of people nodding. They know what I'm talking about. But this is a real site in Orange Park. It was the Yerkes Primate Research Lab that was at that time part of Yale university. It existed from 1930 to the mid-60s. And it was a leading site for chimpanzee research. Like, they would do research on chimps, their cognition and behavior and all that kind of thing. But it was kind of considered a mysterious place for the locals because, they didn't go in there much, and it's an odd thing to have right outside of your town. But there's a legend that it was a place, it was the site where scientists created a half-human, half-chimp creature called the Humanzee, which is a great name. So I hired an artist, one of my cousins, to draw a picture of the Humanzee, because obviously you can't find a picture of that that you could use for free anyway. And so that one was a lot of fun. And I've gotten a lot of stories from people who grew up in Orange Park back in those times that they would go camping near the monkey farm and hear them howling at night and tell them, make themselves scared by going out there. But that one I really enjoy.
Bill, this question is custom crafted for your unique inventory of talents and interests.
Yeah?
Yeah. You have a friend visiting Jacksonville for the first time. You can take them to one site and then lunch. What site do you visit, and more importantly, where do you eat?
So it kind of depends. I would say the number one site to visit for pretty much anybody that wants to know real local history would be the Kingsley Plantation. It's the site of two of the most unusual slave owners in American history. Zephaniah Kingsley was a white man from Scotland. He purchased a young Wolof princess in slavery down in Cuba named Anna Magigine Jai when she was only 13, and he married her and later freed her, and she went on to become a manager of their various plantations. But the Kingsley Plantation is the oldest plantation that still exists. But the interesting thing about it, compared to a lot of other plantations you can visit, is that the cabins for the enslaved are still there. Like a lot of places that you go, they focus on the big house, and the story is all about the planters, the masters. At Kingsley, they do a really good job of telling you what it was like for the majority of people who were there. There's a restored cabin, and you can still see the remains of others made out of coquina around there, and their interpretations are great. They show what kind of crops were grown there, and the wider history of it, and the importance of this area for the growth of Jacksonville and its connections to lots of parts of our culture. Our foodways. I mean, it was our one thing that I write about, considering that he asked for, or they asked for restaurant recommendations, is our Gullah Geechee cuisine. It's something I don't think we give ourselves enough credit for. You go up to Charleston, you'll see lots of, Gullah Geechee food, and Georgia a bit. And here in Jacksonville, we actually have the largest population of Gullah Geechee. They were the descendants of enslaved West Africans that grew up in the Sea Islands between North Carolina and about St. Augustine. But so a lot of food that you can get here originates back in plantation times. Shrimp and grits is a Gullah Geechee dish. Hoppin' John is a Gullah Geechee dish. Seafood boil, which up in South Carolina they call it low country boil and claim that they invented it, but everybody on the coasts, like red rice. In Charleston they call it Charleston red rice, as if they invented red rice. But Jacksonville has the largest Gullah Geechee population of Gullah Geechee descendants, and it's not something that we've really taken a lot of credit for, but our food scene is insane. I've talked to my friends at the Jackson, our food is as good or better as anything you can find in Savannah and Charleston. It's not going to be fancy, and it's not going to cost you an arm and a leg. If you want to overpay, go up to those cities. If you want the same food for less money, come here. So I would say check out any number of our north side crab houses and grab some garlic crabs. That's a specialty that Jacksonville is very well known for. The seafood boil, anything seafood. We do a really good job with seafood.
That was well played about the price of dining out. You are good at what you do.
Yeah.
Who was the author of the question about Leonard Skinner's song "Give Me Three Steps"? Is that Jug or Jag? Jug. So the question is, do you know if the jug on Lenox Avenue is the jug in the song by Leonard Skinner, "Give Me Three Steps"?
It actually is. However, it was not called the Jug when the song was written. It was called, I want to say it was the West Inn Tavern. But the event happened at that bar. The name of the Jug he got from another place. It was a package store up off of Beaver Street. It was called the Little Brown Jug. But the bar where the story happened, if you haven't heard the song, the story is that Ronnie Van Zant goes into a bar. He starts dancing with this girl, and then her angry, armed boyfriend runs in. And so Ronnie Van Zant pleads, "Give me 3 steps towards the door." And he runs out screaming. You can hear him a mile away. Some of the song lyrics. But yeah, that was a real story, and it did happen in that place. They took the name, the Jug, from the song, but it is actually the site where that happened.
That is a great Jacksonville story.
Yes, it is.
It's got everything: music history, violence,
yes,
alcohol. It's the complete Jacksonville experience. What is the story of Bono's Barbecue?
So Bono's Barbecue goes back all the way to 1949. It's one of the oldest surviving barbecue businesses. The original location is out on Beach Boulevard, and I don't believe it's actually owned by the current Bono's chain. It's called Lou Bono's, but it was the original one. Lou Bono later had several others, and when he sold off the chain, they expanded it even more. They've got a number of locations all across Northeast Florida. Since 1980, they've been owned by the Adib family. They also own, if you've ever been up to Springfield, one of the Adib sons, Scott String Adib, owns String's Brewery up on Main Street. But barbecue has a very deep history in Jacksonville. Goes all the way back to Native American times, and the Native Americans of the Southeast and the Caribbean pioneered that kind of slow cooking over open flame. Spanish introduced the pigs, and later comers introduced all the different spices. But if you really want to know about barbecue, the oldest one in all of Jacksonville is up in Moncrief, Holly's Barbecue. It incidentally also claims to be the place where curly fries were invented, and it's just a little barbecue stand, up off Moncrief.
This questioner would like you to comment about the tunnel system in downtown Jacksonville, which is an entry in the book. Mm-hmm. And they also remark on the subway system in Jacksonville. And I think that is a reference to where Myrtle Avenue goes underneath the railroad overpass. Am I interpreting that question correctly? Yeah. So not actually like a passenger subway system, but about those sites. So
Yeah. So the tunnels, there's kind of a myth that in Florida no buildings really have basements. That's not true. In downtown Jacksonville, many of those buildings have not only basements, but some of them are or were connected. And they often, in kind of the central part of downtown, were places for banks to put vaults or to move money around so they wouldn't risk getting robbed up on the street. They could move underground. There's one of those tunnels that is still publicly accessible. The others are not. Like, you got to get, special permission to get down to them. But this one is between two buildings. You can just walk right into one of the buildings, go downstairs, walk through what just looks like a hallway, and you come out on the other side of the street. It's pretty incredible. There used to be a restaurant down there. It was located literally under the street. Benny's Restaurant was there for like 25 years. As far as the subway, that was another thing that underground tunnels were used for, was kind of transit around our huge train system. So the Myrtle Avenue subway, it's, again, not like a subway like a train you would take. It's a road that is made to go under under train tracks. There's other subway tunnels in Prime Osborne Convention Center. They're all flooded out now, but that used to be a train station, and back in the day, the underground tunnels were how people would get to the outer platforms without having to cross tracks. Those are still there. A friend of ours took a kayak down there, and paddled around underground in these flooded tunnels, got some pretty incredible pictures. It looks a lot like Phantom of the Opera, if you've ever seen that.
The Myrtle Avenue underpass, the so-called subway, was a point of contention, a pain point in Jacksonville's first comprehensive municipal plan, which was authored in 1929 by George W. Simons. He took all his own photographs, and one of the memorable photos that I came across in studying the plan was of the Myrtle Avenue underpass. And in 1929, he captioned that with a discussion and said, in effect, boy, was this ever a stupid idea, and this is going to cause trouble. And that's, almost a century ago, and it's still there and still causing trouble. Now there are 2 more layers of interstate highway over top of it. Let's see. There was a question about the trolley car system in Jacksonville, and I think you've spoken a little bit about that, but would you add anything on the subject of the trolley system?
Yeah, this is one thing that I always tell people when they say, "Oh, Jacksonville isn't big enough to have like a streetcar system or better public transit." 100 years ago, we did have that. We had a huge system of streetcars that, in many cases, the developers of different neighborhoods actually paid for. It wasn't the city paying for them. So it can work. It's much more about where we want to invest money and what we're going to do as far as land use goes. It makes a lot more sense when it's in more urban style neighborhoods, which isn't to say like a neighborhood like New York City, but a neighborhood like Riverside or San Marco that's walkable. Those all used to be interconnected with streetcars. You used to be able to just hop on a streetcar and get downtown. Transfer to another one, you get out to Riverside or Durkeeville or Springfield or wherever you needed to go.
Any stories about or legends about either the yellow fever epidemic in Jacksonville and also reference to Jacksonville's, I think, probably one of the most significant events in the city's history, the Great Fire?
Yes, the Great Fire is in there. The monument to the Great Fire that was established in 2000 or 2001, right on the river, and unfortunately doesn't have a plaque explaining really what it's for and why it's in that particular place. But the Great Fire in 1901 destroyed virtually all of downtown Jacksonville. The reason that spot was chosen, it's at the end of Market Street, was because that's where several people died. They got trapped on a dock between burning flames on one side, and the flames were roiling the river up on the other side. And so at least 2 people, possibly a number more, died there. But today it's marked with this really cool piece of public art. It's a big spire that shoots up into the sky. The yellow fever epidemic was one that I had to cut. There are a couple of sites that are connected to that, but it was a past version of the coronavirus epidemic that we're dealing with now. It was back in 1888. They didn't know what caused yellow fever. They had no idea how it spread, and it would just take over a town. And people didn't know that a person really can't translate yellow fever to other people. It's mosquito bites. So it's mosquitoes that bite an infected person, and then bite another one. But it caused a lot of panic. Thousands of people fled the city. It caused the collapse of the local government. But it's one that I unfortunately had to leave out.
More evidence of the need for a volume 2 of Jacksonville, a guide to the weird, wonderful, and obscure. Next year is Jacksonville's bicentennial. June 15th, 1822 is the date from which we measured Jacksonville's establishment. The Jacksonville Historical Society has convened a citywide task force to commemorate the bicentennial, and please visit our website for information about that. But doesn't Bill's work and his research and this book that cries out for a second edition, doesn't that tell you that this is a story about a place that has a lot of history? We have packed a lot into the last 199 years of this city's existence. Mm-hmm. It is younger than St. Augustine, okay, It's younger than Fernandina Beach. Yeah, I get all of that. But what's happened in those places since they were established, right? Jacksonville has got it going on, and
That's
Bill has
right.
done a fabulous job of chronicling that, and I'm ready for the second edition. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Alan.